So today I want to talk about new anti-trans bills that have been proposed in Texas. Given that Texas has been the subject of a lot of news lately, largely due to them passing their anti-abortion law SB 8, it should be rather unsurprising at this point that the conservative lawmakers there have begun to start to target other groups and individuals who do not fit their conservative narrative and whom they deem unworthy of care. Trans individuals, specifically trans children, are their new chosen target in these three new bills that were introduced on September 20th. The first of these bills is Texas SB 28, which hopes to make trans related care illegal by defining said medical care as child abuse, which is not only absurd and against medical science, but could have long term impacts and effects on a lot of trans children if it does come to pass. That said, we will look more into it in a short while. Second is the bill SB 29, which hopes to make it impossible for trans children to change their sex marker on their birth certificate, which could have long term impacts, especially as children's documents don't match their gender identity. And third is HB 10, which seeks to ban trans athletes in school athletic competitions based on those birth certificates. This one is mostly similar to a lot of the other laws that have passed in a lot of other states that have been about banning trans athletes. Except this one, of course, has the addition of the birth certificates to tie it to SB 29. So with that said, let's take a look at these three bills and go over them, starting with SB 28. So here in SB 28, we find a bill that has amended the definitions of child abuse. And within the early parts of the bill, the parts that have not been amended at all, you get the types of definitions like the forms of physical, mental, and psychological abuse of children, preventing, not preventing a child from getting harmed, forms of neglect, all forms of sexual misconduct towards a child, up to and including forcing and coercing a child to enter into marriage. These things are seen as child abuse, and they reasonably belong on this document. Where things are problematic is in the green section, where this is the addition to the bill. So we have here, first and foremost, administering or supplying or consenting to or assisting in the administration or supply of a puberty suppression prescription drug or cross-sex hormone to a child other than an intersex child for the purpose of gender transition or gender reassignment. So there's actually a lot to unpack there. First and foremost, what they're stating is that any parent who consents to and any doctor who provides any sort of assistance in the administration or providing or prescribing any sort of puberty blockers or any sort of hormone-based drugs to a child is in fact committing child abuse in the same form and vein as all of the things that I previously mentioned. It's the same as sexual misconduct towards child. It's the same thing as forcing a child into marriage. It's the same thing as physically harming or neglecting a child or psychologically abusing a child. That is what they are comparing this to. Now, this is not the case at all. Medical science backs these procedures. That is why they're done. What often happens in an ideal situation is that a child, somewhere usually around the age of 11 or 12, when they're first starting puberty, might be determined to want to go on, determined by a doctor to want to go on puberty blockers. These puberty blockers are safe. They have no long-term effects on the body that are in any way consequential, and they allow the child to grow to an older age to make a more informed decision on whether or not they want hormones and to transition. And by giving the child that choice, you prevent them from having to go through the psychological trauma of having to go through a puberty that would be contrary to their own psychological understanding of themselves, as well as to their own physical version of themselves. Keeping that in mind, a lot of people who are forced to go through a puberty that does not align with their gender identity in fact, have long-term consequences in terms of things like feeling more depressed or even suicide in many cases. So providing puberty blockers to a young child and then giving them the option when they're a little bit older with parental consent to be able to access hormones is quite healthy and is quite accepted in the medical community. This is medical science as we know it, and it's well understood and documented. And so in a lot of ways, what this is doing is causing a form of child abuse to a lot of these children if this does indeed get passed. It's going to deny children proper medical care. And in addition to that, it's going to blame not just the children and put them in that position, but it's going to force a lot of the parents who have consented to this to have to be recognized as having abused their children. And of course, that could lead children to be taken away from their parents, be put in some sort of foster or state care system, and then eventually and potentially put in the hands of parents who are willing to do things like conversion therapy, which will harm the child even more. That's also not even taking into account that some children are stealth. And if they're no longer able to get access to their prescription drugs and medication that they take and are given by a doctor and are prescribed quite legally and quite within the ethics of the science, then they themselves will be forced to start going through a puberty that they've never even known or recognized in themselves, and that could be harmful. Imagine being 15 and being on a hormone that is helping you and that you have your parents' support in, and then the state enters in and tells you what you can and can't do with your body, and then by the end of it, after going through 3 years of that type of the puberty that you don't want to be going through, now your body's changed in all sorts of ways and you've kind of been outed. And that can be a really harmful thing, both physically, mentally, psychologically, in all factors. That's what we're dealing with just that short section. Now, when we move forward in this bill, we kind of get the next section, which I understand as more of a straw man. Performing or consenting to the performance of surgery or another medical procedure on a child other than an intersex child for the purpose of gender transition or gender reassignment. Now, I am not aware of any situation in which a medical procedure such as SRS has been performed on a child. Usually they wait till they're 18, and unless there's something medically, necessary to keep them alive or functioning, that's usually not done in any understanding that I have of it. But that's kind of been the conservative straw man that they've put out there, where it's like, oh, see, young kids are getting surgeries and are having all of these procedures done. No, it's strictly the hormones and the puberty blockers that are being given at different ages. And there are ages and brackets that are designed by medical professionals to give these to children at certain times based on the analysis of the individual child. So again, that one's there, but that's mostly there, I think, to scare people. Now, in addition to that, we have a section talking about intersex children. So the reason they've been talking about the exception for intersex children is because intersex children are children who are deemed to be ambiguous in terms of their sex at birth. And so because of that, they want to make an exception for these children, not for benevolent reasons, but because there's a history of intersex children being kind of pushed one way or the other into either getting a procedure or getting some sort of care pushed on them by their parents to, quote, normalize their genitals or their chromosomes or other things. And this has led to long-term negative consequences for a lot of said children because their gender and sex are chosen for them either by their parents or by a doctor. And there's a long history of that happening. And while that is no longer, from what I understand, the medical consensus, there are still some places that do it and still some places that advocate for that. And that is the exception that they're making, of course. And this, again, with everything else, should be understood as abusing and harming children by taking away their necessary medical care, and in the case of intersex children, giving them the time to make the choices they need to determine their own sex and gender over time. Assuming they even have to make that choice to begin with, given the society and everything else. But that is a major issue involved here, both for trans and intersex children. The goal of the state here is to deny them choices, to essentially abuse them and take away treatment, and to cause harm. And if this gets passed, it will cause a lot of long-term significant harm to a lot of children's lives. Now, when we move forward to SB 29, SB 29 is designed to talk about when and how a person's sex could be determined on a birth certificate, and specifically to prohibit the change of sex on birth certificates for certain minors. Now, of course, they're talking about trans minors in this case. Now, the first editions basically say that the biological sex of a child has to be placed on, biological sex has to be placed as either male or female on all birth certificates. Now, this applies based on the determined sex organs, chromosomes, and other factors that are determined by the doctor when they are born. And that's deemed as the, quote, child's biological sex. Now, unless they have ambiguous characteristics, which is the whole intersex thing that we spoke about before, they will not be given any sort of exceptions in that regard. And so that will be the only case. And so that's the first set of additions. But where this becomes complicated and problematic is we have here that the state registrar, local registrar, or other person who issues a birth certificate under this section may not issue, and a court may not issue an order of an issuance of an amending certificate or of a birth certificate that incorporates the completed or corrected biological sex information of a minor unless it is due to clerical error, or unless it was not on the birth certificate to begin with, or the child had an ambiguous or atypical sex organs, chromosomes, or basically if they're intersex, in which case they'll be allowed to correct the information or complete the information. But what basically happens here, especially in that first section, is that trans children will not be able to amend their birth certificates. Now, the unfortunate reality is in a lot of states, your birth certificate and the markers on that document end up determining the markers on other things like passports and driver's license and other things that you need, insurance cards and everything else that determine a lot of aspects of what care you can get as you get older and how you're socially treated. If you end up looking like one gender and you've only gone through one puberty because you've been on puberty blockers and all that, but your documents say something else, that can lead to a lot of really difficult social situations that could cause potential harm to a person. There could be issues in terms of identifying a person that could lead to other legal issues. There's a lot that could go wrong here, and I'm just touching the surface with this one, honestly. But the idea of their documents not matching could have really dangerous effects in the type of state that we live in. That's not even counting the psychological impact of constantly seeing a document that does not match who you are. And so when we move on to HB 10, HB 10 is kind of your standard, trans children should not be allowed to compete in athletic competitions, and then it should entirely be based on, quote, biological sex. Now, the way that they're handling this in this law is tied very strongly to SB 29, where the determining factor of their biological sex will be determined by the birth certificate. Meaning that even if a child is deemed and has only gone through one form of puberty, which is the gender identity they identify as, then they will still be denied because it's deemed unfair because it's not their, quote, biological sex. And that can't be changed, of course, if SB 29 gets passed, meaning they've essentially created a foolproof system to create a situation where they can effectively ban trans students from being able to participate. And what they're mostly worried about is the girls division, because they want to, quote unquote, protect the girls, because suddenly all of these people are interested in girls' high school athletics and interscholastic athletic teams. But it really is about controlling trans children. And that's what most of this is really all about, to be honest. And so it should not be surprising at this point that the conservatives in Texas will continue to push these patriarchal norms as one of their primary tactics going forward. When you have SB 8 that's attacking abortion rights and a lot of these other bills on the table that are taking away the rights of trans individuals and specifically trans children, it seems to be part of a larger and broader strategy that are going to be the strategy really of Republicans moving forward to repeal the rights of women and LGBTQ peoples and make their lives living hells. It's probably not going to be long, and it's a fear that I definitely have, that in the near future we're going to see things like gay marriage be overturned by the Supreme Court, that we're going to see the Supreme Court uphold a lot of these laws that are going to harm trans individuals, that we're going to see a lot more of these conservative pushbacks through these local representative representatives and through the Supreme Court, these conservative supermajorities that they have on the state level, on the local level, and at the Supreme Court level. And of course, with the federal government and the legislative branch, due to the Senate not really being able to function, largely due to Senator Manchin and Sinema not overturning the filibuster, there's going to be no real recourse to dealing with a lot of these if they do indeed get passed. And that's going to affect a lot of children's lives. This shouldn't really be a states' rights issue at this point. This should be about protecting individuals and protecting people and not having the state interfere with what they're doing in their lives. And this particular set of bills will effectively make it so that trans children are not going to be allowed to have access to the medical care that they require for their mental and physical well-being. They're going to have to deal with the additional social stigma due to mismatching documents and the effects of a puberty that they don't want. And some of them don't even know at this point and never want to have to experience because of the long-term consequences that it'll have on their body and their minds. The long-term harm for each individual is truly unknowable, but I guarantee you that there will be blood on these lawmakers' hands if these laws do get passed, or if these bills do in fact get turned into laws. These bills would be a real representation of the abuse of children, and they would cause long-term lasting trauma that could be easily avoided if medical science was taken into account and understood instead of using bigoted judgments to make laws and pass patriarchal norms. And the fact of the matter is, they claim to try to protect the children, but they are in no way interested in that at all. In fact, they're going to harm them. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.